Oh, will you look at that, the Emmys are finally happening. I know I've been known as more of an Oscars guy as of late. Well, as of late, I haven't really been much of an anything guy. But ever since my socks were blown off by that time when Succession and Barry had their finales in the same day, along with The Idol, I realized there's a lot of interesting television out there, and I wanted an excuse to talk about them. So I wanted to watch and rank all of the Emmys Best Series nominations, starting with comedy in this video. Drama will be another video coming out next week. Of course, that is a big commitment. If we crunch up all of the watch time needed to watch all of these shows up to their nominated seasons, you would come out to roughly a lot of hours. Since I haven't seen most of these shows before taking on this project, you can imagine how that drives me a little crazy. So in order to help delude myself into thinking I'm doing something productive with my life, I took this project up with a friend.
And that's where I come in. Hey everyone, I am notably neither Mark nor Nitish, but instead a third person, a friend of theirs named Mish. Now, you might be wondering why Mark asked me to review these. Maybe it's because he respects my opinion. Maybe he realized that he could use a woman's thoughts on this channel. Maybe he accidentally texted me. But I think it's at least somewhat because I have strong thoughts on comedy TV. In my mind, comedies are some of the best of what TV has to offer. I even briefly worked on one. I love when they're seamlessly able to blend laughs and genuine heartwarming moments or gripping plot. And as these nominees show, comedies can really run the gambit. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the Emmy voters had to be on something to call some of these comedies, but I've definitely enjoyed watching them nevertheless. Laughter is a common language, and even if the content which elicits it can vary from person to person, I love seeing the different ways that the creators, cast, and crew of these shows have approached it. Though I think only one of these shows consistently made me laugh out loud, the rest made me exhale air slightly quickly through my nose, and hey, that counts too. It is the best medicine after all, so Mark, let's tell them how we'll be breaking this down.
I came up with my own ranking of these nominees, and so did Mish. We later averaged up our rankings and came up with a new consensus list. None of us are necessarily happy with the final ranking, and you, dear viewer, will not be happy either, but at least all of us will be unhappy together. I wanted to clarify that we weren't ranking these shows as a whole, we were ranking them by their latest season, just as the Emmys technically work. For example, we're not ranking the entirety of Ted Lasso, strictly season 3. Of course, we're not perfect, bias will happen, and we acknowledge this will give the advantage to later or concluding seasons to shows we especially like, since those episodes had the benefit of paying off several prior seasons of legwork, while things like Wednesday or The Bear have to mostly stand alone. However, this could easily be a disadvantage too, if these later seasons drop the ball and screw up what was otherwise a very good show. So I choose to think of that as a kind of double-edged sword.
A few other notes on logistics. We'll be trying to keep this mostly spoiler-free, and we'll do our best to avoid referencing any major twists. If we do, we'll give you a warning in advance. We will, however, assume you've seen all seasons prior to the season in question.
Number 8. I ranked Wednesday number 7, and Mish ranked it last place.
Wednesday is a Netflix show about Wednesday Addams, from the Addams family as a teenager in high school. What's not to love? This show was Riverdale with a bit of Harry Potter for me, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I watched all 7 seasons of Riverdale of my own free will. Yes, most of that was done ironically, but hey, I still spent my time doing it. Like Riverdale, Wednesday feels like an adaptation of nostalgic source material that has been turned into a bit of a campy melodrama for teens or young adults. But Wednesday as a show doesn't really know what it is. Wednesday gets kicked out of high school for attempted murder in the first episode, as one does, to be sent to Nevermore. The school really wants us to know that Nevermore is different and for outcasts, but when we arrive at the school, it's basically High School 2.0, now with more vaguely Hogwarts vibes. Before watching the show, I assumed that the whole plot would be that Wednesday is now considered normal at this new school, and a new character, say her happy and bright roommate, would be considered weird. That would have been a neat subversion of the norm, but instead it's the same kind of high school cast and hierarchy that's been done over and over again, and Wednesday is still the weird one just like she would be in a normal high school. So is this a school for outcasts? Is it not? Is Wednesday just too much of an outcast for the outcasts? I don't know, they'd never really tell us. Anyway, I can set aside shows that have a bit of a weak premise. I can fall in line, but Wednesday has even weaker characters. And when I say the characters fall flat, I don't just mean that they look vaguely similar, which is already a bit weird for a school where everyone is different and an outcast. I mean that the show did not do much in the way of unpacking each character, their backstories, or their motivations. This is something that other shows, including those with young adult and teen casts, have done well before. I'll start with my issues with Wednesday herself as a character. Wednesday is not particularly nice to other people. That, and having been given no reason why she is that way, make her kind of unlikable. It was hard to empathize with her as an audience member. There's a scene early on, for instance, where her roommate Enid talks about her anxiety over not being able to turn into a werewolf, which means that she could end up without family or loved ones. Wednesday's response to this is really dismissive, and she seems to suggest that Enid is irrational or worse somehow for caring about that. It feels like Wednesday is almost implying that she herself is superior in some way, being above all that, when frankly this is a concern that she's probably never had to have because her family has always been accepting and supportive. A quick side note here, because I'm just not really sure where else to put it, but what was that whole conversion therapy for werewolves thing?
Send me to conversion therapy for werewolves.
That is not a descriptor I made up by myself. That is literally what the show calls it. Enid, a character who is already a little queer-coded, has parents who want to send her to conversion therapy for werewolves, and we just don't really come back to that because the issue works itself out, so everything is okay again? I definitely still have a lot of questions. I understand that Wednesday is a teenager and therefore not fully aware of things like privilege or empathy, and part of the show is watching her mature and value others, at least more than she did before. They did not really pull that off in my mind. Most of the students are shown to strongly dislike Wednesday at first and then slowly warm up to her as the show goes on, until she gives them a really good reason to be done with her later in the season. And then suddenly they come back 5 minutes later after emphasizing how big of a blow this was for them. Get some self-respect, guys. But don't worry, it's not just her. Very few of the side characters are developed in a way that made them feel like real people. Why are they here? What do they want? How do they plan to get there? We get maybe 2 out of 3 of these questions per character, and those answers come suddenly and sparingly. I don't need all 3 of these questions answered for every single person in the show, but I would like some fully fleshed out characters. Again, comparing this to The Bear or Ted Lasso, as the Emmys are asking us to do, almost feels unfair because Wednesday just can't hold a candle in terms of characterization. The overall plot feels somewhat half-baked as well. It asks too many questions and does not really answer all of them. I don't have any problems with romantic side plots, but on Wednesday they just typically feel like they're there because the creators needed to fill some time, or because they just thought that's what happened in high school shows. Several characters felt teed up to have more involved stories that just never came to be because Wednesday needed 2 boyfriends instead of 1, and I was left with a lot more questions about them than were answered. I know that there's a second season of the show coming out, but this felt a little less like I'd finished a chapter and was ready for the next, and more like the whole story had just cut off mid-sentence. That said, I do have to give a lot of credit to this show where it's due. Jenna Ortega is a great actress who really expertly embodies the character of Wednesday and brings depth to the role. We mostly get rather subdued acting from her just by virtue of Wednesday's character, but when we get to see her range of emotions, she really shines. Ortega is what elevates the show to what it is, and I'm genuinely curious if it would have received a nomination had she not been the one to play this role. I also liked some key elements of the plot. In general, the episode where families visit the school was my favorite, and I like the stakes that the Addams family as a whole had to play in the mystery. I also loved a specific twist at the end of the show about a certain character's awareness of what's really been going on. I won't say anything more about it to avoid spoilers, but I will say that I thought it was really interesting to see come together and very well done. And when the show doesn't take itself too seriously and leans into its kookier elements, it really is a fun and enjoyable watch. Humor and wit is what made the original Addams Family so enjoyable, and I loved the moments where this show really dipped into that. To be clear, I really don't think Wednesday is a bad show. I actually enjoyed watching it and might enjoy the second season as well. But in a list of shows as stacked as this year's Emmy nominees, it does sit solidly at number 8 for me.
On paper, Wednesday combines everything I should love in a show: supernatural elements, deadpan protagonists, dark academia, murder mysteries, literal Tim Burton vibes. But at the end of the Wednesday, I really couldn't tell you that I liked the show. I want to stress that the show gets the aesthetic right. At least the cinematography is consistently good. Set pieces too, and costumes. Honestly, the show just looks good. I like watching it with the sound off. With that said, I don't think they got a good grasp of tone beyond dark and spooky, which is a surprise because director Tim Burton is usually a master of tone. That's why I was initially looking forward to this show so much. Wednesday wants to be campy and cartoonish, and yet it wants you to take its mystery seriously. There's a way to do this kind of balance correctly, but it feels more to me like they were trying to shove a Scooby-Doo peg inside a Riverdale-sized hole. Not to mention, they kept doing this thing where they just really forced Gen Z slang and other modern things into a vaguely and hardly strung together fantasy coat, and that often broke my immersion right as I was getting into it. The fact that they call Gorgons stoners makes me want to gouge my eyes out, and yes, I haven't forgotten about conversion therapy for werewolves.
Send me to conversion therapy for werewolves.
Yes.
Yeah, anyway, everything feels a little awkward and stilted, as though we're lingering on everything just a little too long. Maybe it's a minute detail, and it does get a little better as the show goes on, but these pacing flubs really added up for me to the point where each episode truly felt like it could have been a half-hour long instead of 1 hour long. But my biggest problem with the show might be Wednesday herself. I want to stress, I don't have a problem with Jenna Ortega's performance, or Jenna Ortega herself, what an icon. It's the character Wednesday and how I am not sure she makes a very good protagonist. Wednesday is supposed to be comically dark and monotone, showing little outward care or emotion, which made sense for how the character originally fit in as a side character in an over-the-top cartoon. However, now that she is the lead character in a murder mystery series that is trying to take itself a good bit seriously, we have to follow her perspective, and it's hard to get invested in the story and its world when the main character herself is not invested in the story and or world. She's invested in the mystery, sure, but she doesn't really know why, and she cares very little about the people around her. I remembered I was going into episode 6, and I happened to see the Netflix episode synopsis, and I read, Wednesday's friends, and I just had to stop. I did not buy that for a second that Wednesday made any legitimate friends throughout the course of the show. Maybe that's the reason why episode 5, You Reap What You Woe, is my favorite. In a sense, the episode feels like a tangent from the overarching plot. The rest of the Addams family arrives, and Wednesday finds herself investigating a murder that her dad was accused of committing in his high school years. Wednesday, as a character, made sense in the original Addams family because she fit in perfectly with the rest of the family, and this episode is able to take full advantage of that pre-established dynamic. This is the most Wednesday felt like a legitimate character, but they could not figure out a dynamic that worked for her with this current cast until maybe around the final episode, and by that point that is obviously too little too late. Number 7.
But hey, we got 38 chances to prove all them folks wrong, though, right? Yeah. And my hopes are as high as a giraffe's top hat.
I ranked Ted Lasso last place. Mish ranked it number 6.
What is the point of a final season? Is it meant to wrap up plot lines, explore something new, or remind us why we fell in love with the show in the first place? Ted Lasso Season 3 is the first of 3 final season on the list of Emmys comedy nominees, and at the risk of spoiling our list, it is ranked quite below the others. I think the way that Mark and I are approaching it is a little different. For Mark, the first 2 seasons of this show made him rank the season lower because he knew how good it could be. For me, they made me rank it higher because I was already a fan of the characters and plot, so I did genuinely enjoy watching even the so-called weaker episodes in a way that I probably wouldn't had I not already been invested. That said, Ted Lasso tried to do too much too quickly here, which leaves much of it to fall flat or feel irrelevant. Season 3's episodes were longer than the previous season, going from a 30 to 45 minute runtime to at least an hour. Frankly, I was fine with these longer runtimes because I generally enjoyed watching the show, even if the added subplots left it feeling unfocused. But what felt weird were the things that weren't included, despite the longer runtime. To list a few of the things that I didn't feel needed to be included, there is 1. Keely's new relationship. 2. An entire plot with Rebecca and a psychic. 3. Much more screen time for Will the Kitman than I expected, who, by the way, according to the credits, his last name is Kitman. Like, Will Kitman the Kitman? Whatever. 4. A faux famous footballer that I believe was meant to be a parody of a real-life footballer. 5. A whole episode where Ted apparently goes on a psychedelic trip. 6. Lots of specifics about Keely's PR firm that were not entirely needed. And 7. Nate's flirtationship. And again, that could all be fine with me. The pacing of Ted Lasso isn't really its strongest feature, and it's not why I tune in, so I'm okay with superfluous plot points, and actually enjoyed several of them, as long as we also make time for the things that matter. But unfortunately, the show didn't. In my mind, Season 3 had one goal, and that was to play the Richmond/West Ham rivalry. And, I guess they kind of did, but in a way that felt like they were doing the bare minimum to check that box. They put time into building up a big bad, but then dismantled him with relative ease. Even worse, the so-called Nate redemption arc was more like a Nate redemption squiggle. I cared more about that than I cared about him, say, finding a girlfriend, which we saw much more of than his actual thoughts about his former actions. And the Richmond players themselves went from so pissed at him that they injured his team to asking him to come back, without the audience really seeing their internal thought process for that change. Oh, and another thing. I did not like the random times that the show sought to humanize Rupert, particularly in episode 10, International Break. I think they could have done something interesting in the way of humanizing him if they made that a goal, but instead it's awkwardly sandwiched between various horrible things he's done and leaves me more confused than anything else. I still don't know why that happened. Turning to a significantly less problematic man, I generally enjoyed Ted as a person and character throughout the season. His optimism and kindness is really the backbone of the show, and I appreciated that he held on to that, despite betrayal and mocking from Nate. That said, there were times where his aloofness and lack of soccer knowledge grew grating. After 3 years, he has to have picked up at least some basic knowledge. I was honestly on board with it over the last 2 seasons, but at times during this one, it just felt like a caricature over a real person. And I hate saying that because I did like him, and I don't particularly care about the sports plotlines. Anyway, despite all of that, I did genuinely enjoy this season. Yes, I definitely think there are some ways it could have been better, but I still had fun. One of the show's defining features is the camaraderie and support of its main cast, and that did not really waver during this season. My favorite part of this season was Jamie and Roy's dynamic. They become reluctant friends and are a consistent quality storyline. I love seeing the ways that they're mutually beneficial for each other. Part of that is Jamie's character arc as he adapts to having a legend on the team that overshines him and realizes that he'll have to grow both personally and athletically to keep up. In the episode Sunflowers, one of my favorites, I liked seeing how Jamie and Roy bonded over their respective traumas and issues without any judgment. I was never a huge fan of Jamie, but this season really softened my thoughts on him. I will add that the way things ended between Roy, Jamie, and Keely was not good. I'm still a fan of Roy and Keely together, and this show made some blunders there. They did Keely dirty, though, in a way that honestly felt pretty uncharacteristic given the first 2 seasons. There's definitely an argument to be made, in fact an argument that Mark's about to make, that the season spent too long focusing on various characters' individual plotlines. That's true, but it did lead to some gems. Ted Lasso has never been a show to take crazy political risks beyond those with which a progressive moderate would agree, but I did enjoy seeing Sam's story about his restaurant and him speaking up for refugees. That felt timely without feeling cheap. Trent Crimm, formerly of The Independent, is a new addition to the main cast, but I liked having him there, especially with his early interactions with Roy. Speaking of Roy, the scene where he celebrates Uncle's Day with his family and a last-minute addition Jamie was one of my favorite moments of season 3 and has the same charm that made me love the show to begin with. Suffice to say that even despite the filler, the show still brought that signature Ted Lasso flair, just less of it. The penultimate episode, Mom City, is a testament to everything the show can be. It has 2 of my favorite scenes, one between Ted and his mom and one between Beard and Nate. Both scenes provide emotional backstories to the American coaches that we hadn't seen before, which are sweet spots that the show just nailed. I thought they were both well written and well delivered. If you've watched and enjoyed the first 2 seasons of Ted Lasso, I definitely think that it's worth it to finish out the show. Despite the hate it gets,
I wonder if you're the worst person I've ever met. At a certain age, it's hard to recall.
I still enjoyed watching it and would recommend it to a friend. The magic is still there, even if it's harder to spot.
I am not one of those guys who is too good for Ted Lasso. Look, I get it, the show can be a little cheesy. It should not have won directing at the Emmys over Barry that last year, especially not over that motorcycle episode. But overall, I am a fan of the show. Jason Sudeikis was born to portray the titular Ted, and the show really derived off of the concept of an outwardly and almost cartoonishly Southern-style man who infuses some genuine optimism into a crass and cynical British sports scene. But his folksy charm and dad jokes were revealed early on to be masking familial strife back in the States and deep-seated emotional turmoil, which adds a new layer of complexity to this simple premise. I'm usually not much of a fan of feel-good hug entertainment. I like a pinch of spicy, a coat of artsy-fartsy, but Ted Lasso was a great breath of fresh air with a wonderful season 1 and 2, and a great cliffhanger that should have effectively led into a stellar final season. I was prepared to go into this video defending Ted Lasso, like ye old mustached knight of Richmond, but season 3 dropped the ball. Well, that's more of an American football thing. Season 3 kicked it off field. Anyway, I personally ranked it on the bottom and it wasn't even close for me. I personally had 2 main problems. 1, there were too many plot lines, and 2, the show fumbled its most interesting material. That's all you need to know, so skip the rest of the segment to avoid spoilers. Ted Lasso has a wide and highly varied supporting cast, and each of these characters are given their own, mostly individual arcs that last throughout the season. Here are all of them on the top of my head. Pay close attention, you'll be quizzed. Keely is running a PR firm, Roy trains Jamie, Trent Krim Independent is writing a book about Richmond, Sam runs his Nigerian restaurant, Colin grapples with his closeted homosexuality, Rebecca wants to be a mother, I guess. New character Java shows up and mucks about before eventually mucking off like one sort of fever dream. Rojas beams Van Damme in the face with a soccer ball, Van Damme becomes Van Damme, Ted is sad, Nate starts to get a solution from his coaching stint in West Ham and also tries to woo a hostess lady, alright! None of these individual plot threads really connect with one another, but all of them take a good bit of screen time, and it makes things really bloated. Keely's PR plotline especially dragged out the season, which is by nature removed from the Richmond soccer team and takes up close to half of the show's runtime before sort of ending abruptly. I respect the idea of giving Keely her own storyline independent from the men. That was sorely lacking in the first 2 seasons. But clearly they didn't really know how to do that because the show immediately paired her up with a woman for most of that arc. Which I guess is still independent from the men in her life, you get off on a technicality, and B, they could have managed her storyline in a much smarter way, one that focuses more, perhaps, on dealing with the optics of the soccer team, because some crazy stuff happens, right? She does this in the story, but that happens mostly off-screen, when it could have been an episode. I have a hunch that the vast majority of people who like Ted Lasso grew attached to seeing the soccer scene, and are much less interested in the ins and outs of running a public relations firm, and the show does very little to change any hearts and minds about that, I think. None of these plot lines really relate to any other, or towards the main storylines, and each extra minute spent on, I don't know, the shit that Dutch guy took this morning comes at the expense of not only our free time, but at the expense of our most important characters. Ted Lasso himself is sidelined hard, and I do respect the attempt at tackling serious issues relevant to the sports scene, being gay in men's sports, being a Nigerian football player in a country that is becoming increasingly hostile towards refugees, having your personal and explicit data released in misogynist data leaks. You can't really tell these stories with Ted as the focus, so I understand that impulse on paper, but Ted is the main character, and is given little to nothing to do until the last 2 episodes, and that's obviously gonna come across as a little strange. It's called Ted Lasso. But I was especially disappointed with the Nate stuff. Oh, my traitorous little worm, how you could have been so much. Season 2 ended with such a compelling cliffhanger, with Nate joining West Ham and going to the dark side. He was a sweet and bumbling kit man in Season 1 who was bullied by the players but showed a lot of surprising strategic potential that Ted recognized. So Ted took a chance on the kid and built him up, but Nate's ego and insecurities got the better of him, leading towards him becoming a much darker and meaner character leading into the 3rd season, exhibiting the same kind of bullying behavior that was inflicted onto him at the beginning of the show. This was one of the more compelling depictions of toxic insecurity I've seen, and Nate became, in my opinion, the most complex and intriguing character in the show, and by a mile stretch too. Of course, we all knew the story was leading towards him finding redemption later on, but this newfound rivalry between his new team and Richmond was such a compelling hook. Ted Lasso loses interest in this new, darker Nate 1 episode into Season 3. In fact, Nate realizes the error of his ways off-screen. What? Why? Hey guys, I know we built up to this massive rivalry between former mentor and student. We played Run the Jewels and everything, it's hype. But I know why you're really here, to see Nate woo this hostess lady at his favorite restaurant.
Back at it like a crack.
I understand that maybe Nate improving on his own, without any direct involvement from Ted and co, or any grand defeat or comeuppance, is a neat subversion on paper, again, and heck, might even make his redemption more earned. But the way it was pulled off here felt more like they were 2 entirely different Nates who happened to swap places. As though Nate was one of the Olsens and I just got parent-trapped. There is so much more I could talk about, but this segment has gone on long enough. Actually, and for a penny, let's make it longer. What was that soap opera-ass therapist plotline? Season 2 taught me that disarming yourself in the presence of a trusted professional can be a legitimately helpful tool for working towards a healthier, better self. Season 3 taught me that my therapist might try to f*** my wife, but I'm gonna have to call it at some point. I do want to say that the first episode of Season 3 was mostly good, and the final 2 episodes, having now focused more on Ted and an interesting conclusion to Nate's arc via his talk of beard, for an improvement that did still make the show feel satisfying at the very end. The finale is, of course, my favorite episode in the season. I can at least report that the final season of Ted Lasso managed to save itself somewhat in the end. It went from an utter dud to a mixed bag. That's not nothing, and I will take it. It could have been a little worse. Number 6.
I mean, if it was simply about getting us caught, the police would be banging down that door. Why am I holding this knife?
I ranked Only Murders in the Building number 6, Mish ranked it number 7. Only Murders in the Building stars Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez as true crime broadcasters who end up solving real-life murders that keep occurring within their apartment complex. New York, am I right? In Season 2, they are attempting to clear their own names in the murder of the apartment building's board president. With every season, there is a new murder, but one fun aspect about this show is that each murder flows rather seamlessly into the next. It's not one continuous story, nor do they feel like disjointed arcs. All in all, I do really like the show, Season 2 included. Even if I found some of its parts to be uneven, Season 2 also included. I am an old geezer at heart. I could honestly watch Steve Martin and Martin Short do their taxes and be fully entertained. I would be lying if I didn't say that was not the main appeal of the show for me. Selena Gomez's character is the more serious of the three, playing the straight man, well, not so straight woman, to the two more comedic old men. I find her character works well enough in the greater story, but I sometimes feel as though they were trying a little hard to make her feel younger or hipper, if you will. Selena Gomez deserves legitimate props for managing to squeeze herself into one of the more iconic comedic duos to have ever comically duoed, and playing off of them pretty well. But I do have to say, once I noticed that she delivers pretty much every serious line in that same sort of grumble, I really couldn't unhear it. I hope we get to see more of her range as the show goes on. When it comes to the murder mystery aspects of the show, and I love a good old caper, the show mostly succeeds. The mystery in Season 2 is overall more interesting, more complex, and more satisfying than the first, and I really liked how the conclusion here felt like it was a culmination of both seasons before it, while still being its own thing. But the show does occasionally spend full episodes on plot threads or red herrings that lead to dead ends rather than progressing the mystery. As a result, it can feel as though there is a good bit of wasted time. This is fairly inevitable for a serial mystery series, and again, it felt better than it did in the first season. But if we're looking for murder mystery shows that are better paced, I might prefer something like Poker Face. One thing I admire about Only Murders in the Building is its willingness to go experimental. However, its risks do not always pay off. For instance, there is one episode that takes place primarily throughout a blackout, and the show takes opportunity to step away from the main plot in order to focus on the previously unseen lives of the show's background characters, the residents of the apartment who were, before, one-off suspects or jokes. This could have worked in some other show, sure, but here it dragged because these people aren't really that interesting. It was also difficult to enjoy while it was intended to be a beautiful and touching moment of togetherness when there's an active chase going on within the walls, in which the life of a teenage girl is at risk. With that said, some risks do pay off. My favorite is the third episode, The Last Day of Bunny Folger. In this episode, we go through the last day in the life of this season's victim, who was previously depicted before as comically cold, unlikable, and pretty much lacking in depth. This episode reveals a much more complex and sympathetic character, without really changing anything about who she is. It's just a matter of perspective. In this episode, our main characters feel like the most annoying people imaginable, so her callousness feels a lot more understandable in hindsight. I just found it fascinating. Overall, the show's not exactly perfect, but I enjoyed myself throughout the highs and the lows, and the new season looks really promising. Paul Rudd is dead. That's not why I said it looked promising. I like Paul Rudd. I wrote this script in July.
Only Murders in the Building feels like hanging out with a good friend from high school. It's familiar, you understand the basics, and even if you don't have all the intricacies of exactly what's going on, you're just having fun seeing where the story goes. I agree with most of Mark's thoughts here about the main trio's ability to gel and the way that the writing takes risk. I also like that this season did more to delve into Charles' backstory as it related to the murder, in the same way that season 1 did for Mabel. It did a good job of balancing out the trio as equally good main characters. All of the main characters got more development throughout throughout the season. I liked Mabel's love interest here, even if I did feel like their relationship wasn't very fleshed out. I felt like they barely got together, then she wasn't present for an episode, and then they put her back in and we were supposed to have surmised that they'd grown a lot closer together as a couple. I like Cara Delevingne, Selena Gomez, and the relationship as a whole. I just wish they'd done more with it. As with season 1, the murderer for season 2 was not really someone you could have predicted from the first episode. I mean, maybe you could have, but I feel like you would have just been randomly drawing characters' names out of a hat to do so. I have mixed thoughts on that as an approach to the central mystery. On the one hand, as a viewer, I felt like I was more passively engaging with the plot twists in the first half of the show because I just knew they wouldn't really matter. On the other, I did enjoy being surprised by some of the twists the show had in store and seeing how they unfolded. It felt like getting on a plane without being completely sure where it was going, but trusting the pilot to get us there anyway, even if there was a bit of turbulence.
I would never do that. What kind of planes have you ridden?
All that said, the final twist and reveal itself left much to be desired. I won't go so far into spoiler land as to say who the killer is. I want you to still enjoy the show, but I will say that I found their backstory to be a really interesting opportunity and one of the better done twists of the season. I remember being really interested by that twist and being very excited to see what they would do next with it. And the twist revealing who they actually are is one of my favorite things that the show did. But after that, the opportunity fell flat. I still feel like their motive was not very well defined, nor was their connection to the overall crime. This season also tried to do a lot, landing most of it but leaving some other moments to fall flat. At some point, like with the Coney Island / Glitter Guy storyline, I felt like I was more bored than on the edge of my seat. I particularly felt that way with much of the Mabel plot this season, which sucked because I felt like she had really good potential coming in. I felt similar about Lucy. She had a lot of potential, but overall I'm not sure what she was meant to introduce beyond further developing Charles's character and giving us a bit of Arconia lore. The specific type of humor used in the show isn't really my favorite, but I still don't think that detracted from my enjoyment. I don't know if I ever audibly laughed at any moments of the show, but it definitely did make me smile a lot. I feel like I watched the show 40% for the overall murder plot and 60% for the whimsy, and this show very much delivers on those accounts. I watched season 3, loved it, and I'll enjoy watching season 4 as well. I only have it ranked so low on this list because I just really enjoy the other shows, but I would definitely recommend Only Murders in the Building to a friend.
Number 5.
You remember the movie Sonic? Yeah. That's the one with the new one with Jim Carrey, right? Yeah. I heard that was not a good movie.
I ranked Jury Duty number 5, Mish ranked it number 4. So, Jury Duty is particularly unique and I am excited to share this one with you. From a distance, Jury Duty looks like another mockumentary that leans into the sort of cringe comedy you might see in The Office or early Parks and Rec or even Abbott Elementary if you de-emphasize the cringe part. However, Jury Duty stars Ronald Gladden, a real-life person, actual certified real-life person, who is under the impression that he is taking part as a juror in a real court case, as a part of a documentary. He has not been told that the court case is fake. Everybody else around him is an actor, making up an eccentric cast consisting of a socially awkward gadget guy seeking to ascend the bounds of human flesh, an aggressively flirty woman with at least a mild criminal background, actual James Marsden, just to name a few. And they are all following one of the most bonkers scripts put to television this year. Everyone except for Ronald, who thinks all of this is actually happening. I love Ronald. Jury Duty is a special hybrid between sitcom and reality prank show, and this gimmick leads to some highly unique opportunities for comedy. Things work especially in the beginning of the show. My favorite is the second episode, just because I think it makes the most out of its premise. There is one scene that I won't spoil, but made me laugh the hardest I did all year. But miraculously, Jury Duty goes beyond prank humor, and it manages to work with the improvisational nature inherent to its premise to give most of its characters a full, and occasionally emotionally fulfilling arc. I was in awe of how they pulled this off, which is why I was so glad to get a glimpse behind the scenes at the end of the show. But honestly, see Jury Duty for yourself. I did think that the premise felt a little thin once we got around the middle, but when Jury Duty works, it was very special television. And now, I don't trust anyone. I could be the next Ronald Gladden. Who knows which of my friends and or loved ones is an actor? Mish might be in it for the long haul. Who knows if my subscribers are even real? Nothing is real, and nothing matters.
I recognize this is a bit trite to say in a video about comedies, but Jury Duty is just fun. I rewatched all of the nominees before recording this video, and Jury Duty is the one that genuinely made me laugh out loud the most, even on a second viewing. Sure, not all of the shows are meant to make you laugh out loud in the same way. What really is a comedy anyway, but now's not the time for my ramblings on how oddly this category has been defined. Like many other 20-something comedy fans, I like a good mockumentary. I grew up with shows like The Office and Parks and Rec, which really popularized a market that has gone on to become somewhat oversaturated. Part of the beauty in these shows comes from their absurdity. They're meant to be real-ish, but not real. In the years since, we've definitely seen many an online essay about how impractical these shows are, or how no one would actually act like that. Abbott Elementary is a bit of an exception, but we'll get into that later. Jury Duty opens up a new door for the mockumentary space by including Ronald, an actual person who thinks that all of this is real and reacts in the way that a real person would. There's no script for Ronald, and many of the other stars have to improvise off of what he does. A huge part of my initial enjoyment was just constantly wondering how they managed to pull off all the different things that they did. I've watched a few interviews with the cast and crew since finishing the show, and the level of thought and planning is even crazier than I could have imagined. Like the Margaritaville scene, in which the cast went to a real Margaritaville for dinner and chaos ensues. At the end of the meal, the bill is suddenly too expensive to be comped by the court, so someone, Ronald, has to find a way to fix it. The way it was supposed to go was that the restaurant would be offering a challenge to eat a plate of 50 spicy wings to get a meal for free, and Ronald would have been volunteered to do it. But the day before the scene was supposed to film, Ronald happened to mention to another one of the jurors that he can't eat spicy food, so they made a last-second change where Ronald instead arm wrestles James Marsden to get him to pay. It's this adaptability that makes the show so strong. But at the heart, what makes the show a hit itself is Ronald. To be clear, I'm cautious of putting anyone up on a pedestal that we only see in TV, but Ronald is really the beating heart of the show. If Jury Duty had just been a normal person put in insane situations that they think are real, it would still be a funny and engaging premise, and I still would have watched it. But what really impressed me upon rewatch was how kind Ronald was. We, the audience, are so used to seeing interactions on TV that we know subconsciously aren't real. But when you actively focus on the fact that nothing Ronald says and very little of what he does was planned in advance, it's pretty amazing that this all came together. His kindness is subtle and not showy. When he's confronted with the chaos of the supporting cast, he commits to meeting each of them where they are. The character of Todd is perhaps the greatest example of this. He is intentionally created to be weird and awkward, and then Ronald meets him with a level of support that frankly I don't think the writers expected. Ronald mentions in a passing comment that a goal of his was to get to know Todd and get him out of his shell, so he took him to the mall to help him get some clothes on one of their off days. We see a few shots of this, but the fact that there wasn't a dedicated scene for it in the way that there was for the rest of the show suggests that this was not a planned moment, but rather a genuine moment of empathy from Ronald. Seeing the way Ronald acted in the show made me want to be a more empathetic person, and I think it's really what made the show as popular as it is. So why is it only my number 4? Frankly, I think other shows just brought more to the table than this one. Jury Duty is kind of a one-trick pony, and it does its one trick very nicely, but at the end of the day, it still has one trick. There were a few points where it did feel like the show was just doing too much too quickly, and also a few moments where it seemed to drag. But those definitely did not prevent me from enjoying the show for what it is. I hope we don't see too many copycats of Jury Duty spring up, because a big part of its beauty is in its novelty. And, frankly, the Ronald of it all. And that's not something you can bet on happening each time. Hey! If you like this video and want to see more Emmys and Oscars stuff, for example, the Emmys Drama Nominees ranked video with Mark's inferior other review buddy, please consider subscribing to MapjStudios and ring-a-ding-ding that little bell icon.
And
let us know which of these shows you've seen before. How would you rank them? Do you disagree? If you have any hate to send, Mark's email is on the screen right now.
hey!
And if there are any shows here you haven't seen, which ones would you want to check out? Let's feed the algorithm and keep the discussion rolling in the comments.
Okay then, well,
On with the rest of the video.
Dang it. Number 4. I ranked a bear number 3, Mish ranked it number 5. She convinced me to move it down a place at the last minute. Or should I say, she convinced me to move something else up. Alright, the bear was the most delightful surprise of this whole marathon. Very much not a comedy, though. I have no idea what the Emmys are on. I also wanted to clarify that I will only be talking about the first season of The Bear, despite the fact that the second season has been out for a while now, because that is the only part of the series currently eligible for the Emmys this year. At the time of writing the script, I have not seen the second season. I am basing this solely off of the first. The Bear stars Jeremy Allen White as Carmy, a renowned fine chef who gives up his career to try to save a failing sandwich shop he inherited after his older brother's sudden death. You know how Ratatouille might make you interested in becoming a chef, or at least inspire you to cook more in the kitchen or to try new cuisines? The Bear did the opposite of that. I don't want to set foot inside a restaurant kitchen lest I deal with the egos, the anarchy, the mounds of debt, or getting stabbed in the butt. Just as Abbott, which we will talk about later, accurately portrays the struggles of an underfinanced elementary school, The Bear accurately portrays the worst case scenarios of stresses, crunch, and heat, metaphorically and literally, in a restaurant environment, and that ounce of genuineness makes this not only one of the most anxiety-inducing shows on television, but one of the most compelling. Through it all, however, the show remains rather grounded, and Season 1 primarily revolves around 3 central characters. Jeremy Allen White, obviously, steals the show as its lead, and whenever he is on screen, you cannot take your eyes away from him. Carmy feels like the sort of tragic, Sisyphean character that will make TV critics and fangirls swoon alike with that infectious sad boy energy. He is constantly teetering on the edges of sanity, and there are times when I was legitimately convinced this man was not okay and will never be okay again. How fun! Ayo Edebiri, who I previously knew from the web cartoon Big Top Burger, plays Sydney, an inexperienced but ambitious chef who joins the kitchen staff in the first episode in order to have a chance to work alongside one of her culinary idols. Yet Carmy is dealing with his own baggage, and Sydney constantly finds herself disappointed by a man she had previously hoisted on a pedestal. Edebiri too is great and very sympathetic in this. No wonder she's in everything right now. Eben Moss Backrack plays Richie, one problematic son of a gun who is now acting manager of the restaurant. He was the best friend of Carmy's deceased brother and often acts as a sort of phantom, resisting Carmy's proposed changes. Richie is a character who often goes from highly unlikable to very sympathetic, often in the span of seconds. These are rich and defined character arcs, but what makes the show work so well is their simplicity. They all come back in one way or another to Carmy. Carmy is the skewer that keeps the shish kebab intact. Food pun! Just as the stand-up scenes are the highlight of Maisel, we'll also talk about that show later, the cooking scenes are the highlight of The Bear. The filmmakers work seamlessly with their choice of music in order to give each cooking experience and its dish its own feel and tone. Sometimes it is frenetic, rapid cuts and blaring sounds to go alongside heavy metal or rap tracks. Other times, somebody might be cooking a dish out of passion, and suddenly the transitions are smoother, the shots linger more, and they accompany a slower R&B or retro song. But the filmmaking and the editing is truly impressive throughout the entire show. My favorite episode is of course Season 1 Episode 7, Review, which pushes the filmmakers to new heights as tensions in the kitchen finally bubble over. Food pun! Filming pretty much the entire episode in what at least feels like one take. Sure, it's not necessarily a new concept, but it's always impressive to see, and implemented well here as a sort of climax to the first season. It's especially impressive when a show is daring enough to take a crack at this kind of concept only 7 episodes into its run. That kind of confidence in its style and in the kind of stories it wants to tell bodes a lot of healthiness and makes me so excited to see Season 2 if it is as good as people say it is. My only criticism with the show so far is that its conclusion feels too easy or one-sided of a resolution, which is out of character for The Bear. But even then, we are treated to fabulous moments like its surreal opening sequence and a stellar 7-minute monologue by Jeremy Allen White. Give this man an Emmy already. He's sautéed for your sins.
Something has gotta be wrong with me. I don't know what it is, I just could not get into The Bear on my first watch. I think that was fueled by 2 things. First, I think I missed some of the incredible cinematography, which is a big part of the show's charm. I missed a few of these shots while, say, grabbing a snack or answering a text. Boo me if you wish, dear listener, but I think that the medium of TV, compared to, say, a movie, cannot always expect that its audience will constantly pay rapt attention. It is a medium that is meant to be consumed in the home, to be binged even. All episodes of season 1 of The Bear were released on Hulu on the same day, which especially plays into that potential bingeable format. The second reason I think my initial viewing of the show was off is that I began watching it as a nominee for Best Comedy Series. That meant I was waiting for, comedy. I remember texting Mark on episode 3 just being like, where are the jokes? When do they start coming into the show? Mark is right. I have no idea why this is in the comedy category. It's a good show, but I did begin watching it expecting it to be a comedy and was very confused. And like Mark, I've only seen season 1 of The Bear so far. I've heard that it's a bit like Fleabag, where seasons 1 and 2 form a more complete plot that leaves you appreciating the first season more. I loved Fleabag, so I'm excited to watch season 2 of The Bear and see how it shifts my thoughts. The Bear is a technically beautiful and emotionally complex show. Its beauty comes in the way that it handles movement and fluidity for me. That's true, of course, of the cinematography, which really makes each scene feel connected. Mark has already pointed out the penultimate episode in which the severity of the tension in the kitchen culminates in scenes that feel like they're taken entirely in a single shot. While other shows might cut these scenes up to focus on the important bits of dialogue or visuals, The Bear knows the importance of taking time to breathe. And it does so masterfully. It leaves its audience to stew, in the energy of a moment. The Bear's brilliant use of fluidity is also true of the movement and development of its characters. We see characters like Richie who contain a lot of conflicting emotions and desires. A key theme of the show is the harm that arises when characters are unwilling to adapt and be moved. Carmy, for instance, starts the show unwilling to compromise on his idea of what a restaurant should look like. He's unwilling to make his brother's standout spaghetti, for example, because it doesn't fit with the rest of the menu. But he's also unwilling to compromise on how he explores his grief until his sister finally talks him into attending an Alcoholics Anonymous family session. It's only when he starts to concede that listening to other people can be a helpful option, and he doesn't always know what's best, that he finds catharsis. We see the same lesson over and over, such as with Tina. She starts the show grieving Mikey and wary of Carmy and Sydney. She's dubious of their goals and what they will mean for her. But as she works with them more and opens up, she even brings her son in to learn as well. She sees them and their ideas as a valid option for improvement. Every chef in The Beef has a similar arc, and at times we see those arcs clash, but we also see them grow together when they're willing to be moved. Speaking of chefs in The Beef, Mikey, Carmy's dead brother and the restaurant's former owner, is largely absent from the show physically, but it's clear the role he played in the characters' lives. It's notable that despite being in the show for only a few minutes, John Bernthal was nominated for a guest actor spot for his portrayal of Mikey. To use a spaghetti analogy, Mikey was the pot of boiling water to their pastas, not asking them to change much of who they are, but asking them to be flexible enough to coexist and slowly change the environment around them demands it. Some of the most impactful moments of the show for me were the ones where we see Carmy interact with the ghost of his brother. Mark has already discussed the surprise and disappointment that Sydney feels when she meets her culinary icon, but Carmy is dealing with an entirely different level of surprise and disappointment, this one posthumously with his brother. He says that Mikey is his best friend, but that he's the kind of guy who makes everyone feel like he's their best friend. And slowly, as the show progresses, we see his knowledge and understanding of his brother change. When Carmy finds out that Richie has been dealing cocaine in the alley by the restaurant, he's understandably upset. It's only when he realizes that Mikey not only knew about that, but suggested it, that he pauses. And later, when the beef needs the money, he asks him to do it one last time. Throughout the show, we see his understanding of his brother change over and over as he learns more about the space he inhabited day after day. I have an older brother who I don't get to see on a daily basis, but who I still consider one of my closest friends, so watching Carmy's journey just really resonated with me. But my favorite character in the show is Sydney. Sydney serves a very unique role that is, in other shows, filled by the main character. She's a newcomer to the space, and through her eyes, the audience, newcomers ourselves, learn how things work. I think that's an interesting distinction, as Carmy is also a newcomer to the beef, but he's worked there for 2 weeks by the time the show picks up and has other privileges, like his elite culinary background and ownership of the restaurant. I appreciated seeing Sydney's journey as she wins over the crew, and I especially appreciated seeing how she has to work even harder to fully win over Carmy, who has always appreciated her, but has been too caught up in his own mess to realize her value. So, as Mark keeps asking me, why isn't the show rated higher? Honestly, there's no specific thing that's holding me back. The Bear is a great show, even if it is not a comedy. I just think that I enjoyed the other shows more in this category. I guess I do have one question, which is, when does the bear, the actual animal, show up? We saw him in the first episode. Where is he? When does he come back?
Number 3.
Awesome. You can head out right this way. Oh, my bad. You the dock crew. You're the one with the bird tattoo, not the snake.
I ranked Abbott Elementary number 4, Mish ranked it number 3. Abbott Elementary is a mockumentary series following a group of elementary school teachers in an underfunded Philadelphia public school. It is the probable frontrunner to win comedy series, maybe the Bear, and I think this is a stellar pick, even if it wouldn't be my personal pick. Abbott is simple and intentionally so. Stylistically, the show doesn't stand out too much. The mockumentary format is neat, but nothing that hasn't ever been done before. And the jokes, too, feel simple and standard sitcom fare, although it is notably more grounded compared to its contemporaries like The Office, Parks and Rec, or even, recently, Jury Duty. Gritty makes a cameo though, so I was really into that. However, Abbott drives off of its unique and relevant subject material. The show has received a lot of praise for the realistic and respectful way it depicts the often unseen struggles of public school teachers, especially when they are working in an under-resourced school. I would almost say this show's mandatory viewing for that reason alone. It is such an important thing to see on screen. Though it remains primarily episodic, Abbott focuses on how underserved public schools are often put aside in favor of schools in more affluent areas, or flashier alternatives. Season 2, which is roughly twice as long as the first, pits Abbott against a charter school that is attempting to take over Abbott, while continuing to flesh out previous relationships and never losing track of the heart of the show. It's hard to pick a favorite episode because this entire season is pretty consistent in quality. Still, Educator of the Year stood out to me because of the monologue Melissa Shimetti gives. It ultimately comes down to taste. I tend to like a different kind of comedy, something with just a little bit more absurdity and grit, while Abbott is, by design, optimistic and inviting. But I think Abbott Elementary is the best version of itself that it can be, and it is probably doing the most actual good out of any show here. I'm so happy it exists, I think it would be a worthy winner.
I love Abbott Elementary. While Mark, a known hater, seems to prefer more grit in his comedy, this show really falls in my specific sweet spot. I went to underfunded public grade schools, and questions of school reform and policy are deeply important to me. But beyond that, I am just a fan of good comedy, and man, does this show deliver. Abbott is the latest in a long line of shows to fit the mockumentary niche, but describing it as a continuation of others does a disservice to the show. This show is so smart with its comedy and storytelling. Each character feels like a unique individual without falling into the trap of being too larger than life. I know an Ava, I know a Jacob, a Janine. They feel like real people with rich backstories. If we were to compare this show to the only other mockumentary on this list, Jury Duty, the characters in Abbott feel more real. Some of that feels intentional on both shows' part, but it's still noticeable nevertheless. I know that with some comedy shows, they can fall into the trap of being too unrealistic in service of a joke. With Abbott, on the other hand, the environment in which the story exists is already so unhinged that the audience doesn't need to suspend disbelief. Every teacher friend I have has been very clear that Abbott Elementary is basically a real documentary of what their life is like in the American public education system. That's terrifying. You'd have to be living under a rock to not be aware that schools have become a battleground for teachers who are underpaid and only want to make kids' lives better. Quinta Brunson, the creator and star of the show, is the daughter of a Philadelphia school teacher herself, and it's clear from watching the show that she's carried a passion and respect for the profession, one that only seems to grow. You may have heard, for instance, that Abbott donated its 2022 Emmys marketing budget to schools in need. Public school is a fertile ground for commentary, and Abbott's ability to be realistic about how dire the situation is, but still infuse it with comedy is its strength. I don't think I can honestly say that every episode leaves you feeling good about the state of the world or public education. It would be disingenuous to the subject matter if it did. And frankly, that's what sets this apart from other mockumentaries. I didn't feel the same way about Parks and Recreation, another good mockumentary about passionate people working thankless jobs to make their community a better place. Since the main cast was established in the first season, season 2 had the space to delve more into their background and interpersonal relationships. For instance, the episode Mom introduces, surprise, surprise, Janine's mom, who up until this point was more a concept than a person, more a background than a real individual. But it also deepens her relationship with Barbara. I really like seeing how Janine and Barbara's relationship grows throughout the show, and their dynamic particularly evolves in this season as Janine grows more confident in herself and her teaching. Like with Carmi and the Bear, it's the moments where she finally realizes she can't do everything herself, and that she'll have to ask for help that she grows the most. Possibly the most notable relationship of the show is Janine and Gregory. They're the Jim and Pam of the show, but in my mind better and more real. I'll be honest, I am not thrilled with how the season ends with the two of them, but I do think that the outcome makes sense for the characters as they've been established. Season 3 needs to do more with that though. I could easily see the show falling into the trap of waiting too long to do enough with it, which would be really disappointing because I think the setup is good. Abbott has one other big thing on its side: consistent quality. The shows that I've ranked higher on my list seem to have dipped in quality midway, at least according to Emmy voters, but Abbott is still relatively new, and season 2 delivered just as much quality humor as the first. There hasn't yet been a moment in which I would expect voters to have grown bored or disillusioned with the show itself, and I think that leaves it in a good spot to potentially take this category. Most of all, however, I think it deserves the win just because it's a good show. As Mark said, I'm glad that it's on TV right now, and I just can't wait to see what season 3 has in store.
Number 2.
Don't forget to tip your waitress. She's saving up to send her kids to Pittsburgh. I'm Mrs. Maisel. Thank you and good night.
Mish and I both ranked the final season of Marvelous Mrs. Maisel number 2. So, what's the deal with the Emmys? They're not the Oscars, and their eligibility criteria is all out of whack. Yuck, yuck, yuck. That's how Seinfeld laughs now. I've decided that. I get the impression that both Mish and I like the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel more than most people, but call me Joel, because here I go simping for Maisel.
But isn't Joel also Maisel? He's where the Maisel comes from.
Don't worry about it. Mish actually convinced me to make Maisel number 2 and Bear number 3 at the last minute, so you can blame her, I don't know. I stand by the quality of this show, especially season 5, which might be my favorite out of the entire series, because it does something I found especially compelling. While seasons 1 to 4 follows Midge and her manager Susie as they gradually climb the ladder of show business, it's a fairly conventional setup. Season 5 takes it for granted that we know Midge will eventually succeed in becoming a famous stand-up comic. So in its very first moments, the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel rips that band-aid off and flashes forward to that reveal. It's the 80s! Midge is a very famous comic. Her daughter has some issues, but enough about that, let's go back to where we left off. The show goes on to balance 2 different timelines. The main, present storyline we've been following since the beginning, as Midge tries to seize a career-making opportunity, and a future storyline, told non-linearly as a cold open in front of most episodes, telling us what eventually happens to our cast. This feels almost too ambitious for a show like this, but I gotta tell you, this really worked for me. We are not only left wondering how these characters eventually get from point A to point B, we get to see little events in the present timeline that we know will butterfly effect into otherwise surprising outcomes, but we watch Midge at the tail end of her journey while being fully aware of the sacrifices that success will entail. That makes the season overall bittersweet. I'm happy for Midge, but I'm also dreading the costs, and seeing said costs fully explored in episode 6, the Test of Rostiel, which takes place entirely in the future timeline, was a definitive highlight of the entire show. But this sense of inevitability also elevates the current moment, the beating heart, the calm before the storm. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is, of course, about the Midge formerly known as Maisel, but the show is always sitcom-esque too in its dedication to its B and C plots. Its dedication to exploring the side characters like Midge's parents, top-tier television parents by the way, or her ex-husband as he scrambles to deal with finding a new life after divorce he clearly regretted instigating. Despite how irrelevant these plotlines are for the main storyline, really only Midge and her manager Susie are technically relevant to that main part of the show. One of the most impressive things about Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is how it made me care so much about the side characters. At times, I was legitimately more interested in Midge's dad than I was in Midge herself. In Season 5, the show's dedication to these side characters makes the most sense, however. We're reminded it's these little moments that will ultimately be lost in the face of incredible success and fame. Through it all, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel maintains its lavish style. It is still one of the better looking shows on this list, and witty script, which maintains its rapid-paced zinger after zinger dialogue typical of a sitcom with a more ambitious overarching plot. The show continues to feature its wonderful stand-up routines. Thanks to its stand-up consultant, these routines stand along as their own thing, and there's a clear love for live performance in general that shines through, even if it fully embraces the camp of it all. At this point in the show, I have become super attached to all of its characters, and though not all of them get the happy ending I wish they got, Joel really got the shit end of the stick, wow. I come to a point where I understand their decisions. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is a very solid show that, granted, can be a little hard to binge with its feature-length episodes, but it sticks its landing in a way that makes it well worth it.
My kids, God, promise their names will come to me. Ethan and Esther. I knew it would come to me eventually.
The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel has been a show with ups and downs for me. I actually stopped watching the show after season 2, which I thought was just okay, and again after season 3. But I came back each time because I liked the storytelling and I wanted to know what happened to the main cast. And plus, sometimes you just want something on in the background, you know? Anyway, I'm so glad I came back because the final 2 seasons have been highlights, particularly this last one. The 5th season opens on Esther, Midge's daughter, in therapy 20 years after the show's main timeline. I thought this was a brilliant move, and it's reflective of a motif that the show uses throughout the season. Mark has already talked about this, but I just have to echo how smart it is. Maisel has taken what many other shows view as a requisite for the last 10 to 15 minutes of a finale episode and spread it out over an entire season, which uses the future to add tension to the past. It's a wonderful move, and one that I'm not sure many other shows could do well. I didn't always like what happened in the future. As Mark says, Joel really does get screwed over, but I still have to appreciate the way that they revealed it to us. I rewatched this show after rewatching The Bear, which I found a really fascinating juxtaposition. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel juggles chaos and movement like The Bear, but it does so in a completely different way. The Bear feels hectic, like leaves caught in the churning water behind a ship. Maisel, however, is driving the fucking boat. The show feels like Midge herself, confident and thriving in a fast-paced world with a brain going a million miles an hour. And yet, unlike The Bear, that pace doesn't feel too fast in the moment because the show fills it well. Both shows' pacing fit the moods that the creators wanted to convey, and for Maisel it is a symphony that is a delight to behold. The first episode of the 5th season has a scene where the family gathers for Thanksgiving dinner. It's an ensemble cast of 11 people, plus 1 baby, all carrying multiple conversations between 2 different tables, and it's a mess. Arguments ensue, secrets are revealed, multiple people hop between the tables, and the scene just has an amazing energy. Mark's other review buddy Nitish actually walked in while I was watching this scene and said, wow, this is just incredibly well done. It's a scene that feels reflective of the season itself. There's rarely just one thing going on at any given moment, and there's a constant passion to what is happening. Even in scenes like this one, where Susie meets with the late-night host Gordon Ford, it's a really important moment at the end of the first episode of season 5, but there's an entire burlesque routine happening in the background throughout the whole conversation. That routine is not particularly needed, and frankly the same plot point could have been conveyed without it, but it just goes to make the whole thing feel much more alive. But this pacing also allows them to punctuate moments of depth, and oh boy does the season have a lot of those. Spoilers coming in 3, 2, 1. Take this scene where Midge's father Abe has a conversation with his friends. The scene itself is 10 minutes, with just over half comprised of a monologue by Abe. At first, the men debate the dinner menu and lament the way the world has changed in their lifetimes. The typical fast pace of the show gradually slows throughout this discussion of involving societal norms, until Abe says his fear is that the world now is as it always was, but that they just didn't see it. He dismantles his own biases, the way he encouraged his son Noah to achieve great things and took him to tour Columbia, but he adds that he doesn't know if he ever did that for Midge. He admits that she owns their apartment, and that he appreciates her commitment to her career. He describes the strength she had after her divorce, a strength that he doesn't know if he could have, and confesses his fear that she potentially always had that strength but he had missed it. He takes his time, he breathes, and the show that is so often consumed by movement and excitement is slowed to allow the audience to sit steeped in his words. Watching the last 4 seasons, I felt like the show has had a lot of themes to explore, sometimes too many, but this scene really hammers home one of the biggest, changing ideas about what success looks like for men and women. For men, at first, it's an impressive job and providing for the family. For women, it's being a homemaker. The whole show has been unraveling these ideas, but season 5 just pulls the whole sweater apart. This season has a number of absolutely attention-grabbing scenes, but for me to talk about my favorite, I'm going to issue a spoiler warning for the finale. I meant it when I said I watched the last 4 seasons of the show wondering what it was getting at and what everything was building up to. Some of those seasons almost felt like they were just showing us Midge's life without a clear goal in mind, but season 5 has a grounded awareness of where things would end, as evidenced by the flash forward. And for me, it feels like the whole show has been leading up to this scene, when Midge finally delivers her stand-up to the world. I love this moment right here when Midge sees the mic. I love the way the camera circles around her as we see the idea to take the stage come to her, and I love when she finally does it. I get chills right now just thinking about it. I've watched this scene several times and always find myself just grinning throughout the whole thing. There's a beauty to how hard she had to fight to make this opportunity for herself, how she had to break the rules, including a few of her own, to make it happen. I love pretty much everything about the way the scene is done. I love that it looks like she's at the gaslight again. I love that we get to see her family watcher. I love all of it. Unlike Mark, I'm not always sold on the stand-up scenes, but damn if I didn't tear up watching Midge finally get the spotlight, let alone a few moments later when she's finally invited onto Gordon Ford's couch and dubbed the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I feel like I should note that the finale does wrap up a lot of problems a little too nicely and with a neat little bow, but honestly, I enjoyed it so much that I don't really care. In case it's not clear, I have a lot of thoughts on this show. If you stopped watching or haven't seen it, I would at least suggest watching the first, fourth, and fifth seasons. You honestly don't miss too much in between, and you can get caught up online pretty easily. There's a lot to love about the last season of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, but particularly the pacing, finality, and the message about femininity leave it squarely in my number 2 spot.
Number 1. Spoilers in the footage,
Some call me Marine. Other people only call me a hero, but I don't like putting labels on things.
Mish and I both ranked the final season of Barry number 1.
Barry is a dark comedy about a depressed, washed-up hitman who tries to find himself by becoming an actor in Los Angeles. At least, that's how the show started. But 3 seasons later, and things have gotten much, much more complicated. Before watching Barry, I knew star and co-creator Bill Hader from SNL, specifically as the character Stefan from the Weekend Update segment, whose personality traits are basically just being gay and weird. Or this one, where he plays an odd Dateline host. Or this one, where he's just a weird guy from California. I for sure was not expecting this.
If I saw you walking down the street, I'd fucking kill you, I'd kill your fucking kids, I'd kill your fucking wife, and I'd kill your fucking mom.
He's gone crazy.
And yet, somehow it works. It works really well, actually. As with Maisel, I stopped watching this show early on. I initially stopped a few episodes into season 1 because I just wasn't really into the plot or characters, but Mark swore it was a great show, so I picked it back up, and again, I am so glad that I did. The show is complete insanity. I honestly don't know what else to say. It's an unhinged cacophony of chaos, violence, and bad improv. The best way I can describe it is to say that it feels like everything I was told Breaking Bad was, but in my opinion, better.
You broke my heart.
Unlike Breaking Bad, Barry has no disillusionment about its main character, and it won't allow us, the audience, to have any either. He's not meant to be cool, he's not meant to be admired, he's just meant to be a guy. A sometimes childish guy. He's an anti-hero. It's him, hi, he's the problem, it's him. I don't see how anyone could watch this show and watch the ending and glorify Barry, although I couldn't really imagine that happening with Walter White either, and here we are. Whereas Breaking Bad starts with Walt entering a life of crime, Barry picks up after Barry has been in that life for a while. He's tired and bored, and the job has lost any excitement. While on a job, he happens upon an improv class with a girl that he likes, and in her, and in this class, he sees a life that he could actually enjoy, a life that he thinks he deserves. Season 4 somehow brings Barry both closer to and farther from that idealized life than ever before. At its core, Barry's a show about the nature of evil, and if humans are ever truly able to change who they are. It asks if our actions, particularly the worst parts of ourselves, can be blamed on the external forces that pushed us to them, and when we need to take accountability. To borrow a quote from the musical Wicked, are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them? Season 4 in particular is about the idea of tricky legacies, and if a standout action, good or bad, should be allowed to overshine the rest of the things we've done. I know I was just making fun of Mark for his interest in grittier comedies, and I'll never apologize for making fun of Mark, but here we are actually agreeing on something gritty, and in the top spot nevertheless. Season 4 is a masterclass in writing, taking on a darker tone than any of the previous seasons. It's essentially split into 2 parts by a twist that I don't want to spoil here, with the first half feeling like a gritty crime flick, and the second feeling like whatever happens next, after the excitement and the lore have worn off, and actions have consequences. Up until this point, a central tension of the show was wondering if Barry really could have it all, and balance a life as a hitman and a life as an actor/boyfriend/normal guy. Season 4 answers that question with a definitive no. Barry's cover has been blown, the whole world knows who he is, and pretty much all of his friends have left him. The audience knows this is an irrevocable shift for the show, and that the last season will be something different than that which we've come to know and love. But honestly, I don't think any of us could have predicted just how different it would have been, especially that aforementioned mid-season twist. But beyond the phenomenal plot, one thing I loved about Season 4 in particular were the storyline's ties to religion. The show makes a big deal of Barry, the person's, almost compulsive need to follow orders. We see that somewhat in flashbacks to his time in the military, but we particularly see it in his dynamic with Fuchs. With Fuchs, he's able to have plausible distance between himself and his action. He isn't the one killing someone, it's Fuchs telling him to do it, and he's just pulling the trigger. When he becomes interested in acting, it's his instructor Jean Cousineau who gives him orders, though they're more the play the scene this way type of orders as opposed to the kill this guy type. It feels like they're his cognitive out. He's able to say that his actions were simply the outcome of them telling him what to do, good or bad. But when he's suddenly separated from these figures, he instead turns to God. Now, I'm really interested in the different ways that film and TV depict faith in God, so this is a standout for me without being a major focus of the season. Barry's faith, however, seems to almost stem from the idea that it's what he's meant to do as he attempts to assimilate to a caricature of the life he's now living. He believes, a good person, playing a specific role, and faith just slots into what that world is supposed to look like. It's only as he's pushed to leave that world, that he's going to do something he knows is wrong without his karmic middleman, that he looks for approval to do so. What follows is a ridiculous montage of him listening to a series of progressively more unhinged Christian podcasts until he finds one that says going back to his own ways isn't a sin. Even when he's making the choices for himself, he still needs to be told it's okay to do them before he can. But at the same time, Barry seems unwilling to actually atone for his actions. He almost feels childish in a way. There's a moment in the first episode where he calls Cousineau, who aided in his arrest, whose girlfriend he killed, and asks, "Are you mad at me?" Like, yeah, Bear, of course he is. Over and over again, Barry says that he's a good person, but he doesn't provide a reason why. It just seems to think that he can say it and make it so. In prior seasons, he said that he'll leave everything behind, quote, starting now, while he keeps restating where now is after every murderous slip-up. I have to tie that back to this poster that I found, which feels like it's meant to evoke the idea of Barry standing in the Garden of Eden, eating an apple from a tree while standing next to the shovel that he just used to bury his last victim. It's a striking sense of imagery that really relates to what I loved about the religious ties of this season. At the heart of all of this is a motif present throughout season 4, tricky legacies. The main cast are obsessed with the idea of how they'll be remembered. For some, like Sally and Cousineau, that's clawing for every bit of notoriety and fame possible. For others, like NoHo, Hank, and Barry, it's attempting to sanitize their bloodied hands with the stories they tell, both to themselves and others, about who they are. Barry, the person, even starts to tear down legacies of the so-called greats, including a side plot where he almost obsessively tries to uncover the skeletons in Abraham Lincoln's closet, as if to assure himself that he can also be a good person who's remembered well despite his past sin. The finale, which I won't spoil here, throws this question back in our faces, and as the credits roll, we're not entirely sure what to make of it. Speaking of the finale, I know it won't be everyone's cup of tea, nor will the mid-season twist. They weren't exactly mine, and I had to sit with them for a while before deciding how I felt. Now, a good few months later, I've decided that I like them. With a show as unhinged and diffuse as Barry, it's pretty difficult to decide exactly how it should end. I can definitively say that Barry ends with a bang, even if that bang is not going to please everyone. So, if you can handle violence and sardonic humor, Barry is worth the watch. I loved it and have come away more impressed with each rewatch. There is, after all, a reason Mark and I both rated it so highly. I know there's a pretty low chance of it taking the Emmy for this category, but that doesn't change my mind that it really deserves it. I've watched a lot of wonderful shows in the course of this review process, and I still feel like Barry takes the cake and smashes it into smithereens. It's a show that deserves a spot amongst the greats.
Full stop, I think Barry is a masterpiece. But in the face of many people saying Barry's no longer a comedy, or that it's too dark or depressing to be here, I want to make a different sort of argument. I think Barry, season 4 included, is a comedic masterpiece. Haha, it just focuses on a very different and kind of messed up kind of humor that makes the show particularly unique amongst these selections. I, who has been regularly accused before of being a kind of messed up guy, am particularly fond of this. Barry is not necessarily funny haha in its latter 2 seasons, unlike Abbott or Maisel, but it's not really a drama either, like I might argue The Bear is. Barry is more of a tragicomedy, my favorite genre, in that it depicts a legitimate tragedy or otherwise dramatic story and takes it seriously, but it also takes enough of a detached macro view of these events so we can't help but notice the comedy or irony behind it. Banshees of Inisherin is a recent and stellar example of a tragicomedy. The main tragedy depicted here is the journey of our main character Barry as he attempts to leave behind his life as a contract killer to become an actor. In other words, just wanting to live a normal life with a wife, kid, and/or Oscar. In the previous 2 seasons, this journey is primarily depicted in comedic terms, and our protagonist, Barry, is depicted as troubled but sympathetic, like a puppy dog with a machete. I genuinely wanted him to succeed, and whenever he did slip up and kill a guy, my reaction was less scathing as it otherwise should have been, and more like said puppy dog just took a pooper on the rug. I found the simpler storyline compelling in of itself, to the point where season 2 was, and still is, my favorite in the series. But this perspective changes drastically halfway through the show when Barry crosses a line that he, and the show as a whole, could never walk back from. Barry is depicted less as an adorkable and repentant anti-hero who we are meant to sympathize with, and more as a genuinely dangerous and delusional basket case who is scrambling to claim the sort of redemption story he no longer deserves. Redemption becomes less of a journey and more like a thing our former hero feels entitled to, as his list of sins only becomes larger. It is at this point where Barry as a show becomes a lot less feel-good and a lot darker. But I would argue it's still pretty funny, and I think the show, spearheaded in its final season by Bill Hader's marvelous writing and directing, is fully aware that this is pretty funny. Like, yes, it's messed up that Barry no longer has any friends or allies at this point in the show, but it is pretty funny that he expected anything different. Like, what did he think was gonna happen?
Congratulations, you played yourself.
Silly goose, silly. Yes, when Barry eventually gets what he wants on paper, a quiet, conventional existence, it is real messed up and depressing to see how awful this life ends up being, and how this goes on to affect the innocent who is attached to him. But when I see him in denial about how awful his slice of suburbia is, I can't help but chuckle at a second glance.
You played yourself.
While the show does occasionally go into more conventionally funny territory, especially thanks to the antics of best character in the show, NoHo Hank, most of the comedy felt more noticeable for me on second viewing due to just the dry absurdity of the situation. Look at Barry preparing for his final battle in the finale. Nothing outright funny is happening, nobody's cracking wise or doing a funny thing, but the image of a guy walking out of a Walmart with 2 machine guns strapped to his back is not only just a pretty goofy image that haters more than happy to linger on, but it even sneaks in some subtle commentary about how easy it really can be to acquire deadly weapons on the United States. Barry, the show, largely thanks to its immaculate direction, succeeds best in doing many things in simple strokes like this, and Barry, the guy struggling to get into his car at the end of the sequence, is the icing on the cake. Season 1 and Season 4 feel like entirely different shows entirely. I enjoyed them all, but if Barry started off as a particularly well done, if rather standard comedy action show, Season 4 dabbles into far darker, surrealist, and subversive territory. I understand that shift feeling inconsistent or throwing some people off. You could very well argue that it is messy. You could very well feel dissatisfied or even upset that the show grows to arguably disdain the very same characters that you might have become endeared to at the start. It even drew me off after first viewing. I wasn't sure how I felt about the ending initially. If I did this ranking right after watching, I probably would have ranked the season below Jury Duty. Season 4 did not scratch that same itch I was initially looking for, but the more I sat on it, the more I realized how unique this experience was. How this was the perfect conclusion for the kind of show Barry would eventually become. Over time, it just made sense to me. I'm not sure Barry is for everyone at the end of the day. I would recommend Abbott Elementary to just about anybody. Maisel, Bear, and Jury Duty too, and I would still highly recommend everybody at least give Barry a shot. I just can't guarantee you'll like it in the same way as these other nominees. But if this show does work for you, it will really work for you. I think Barry Season 4 is the best amongst these nominations, and I don't think it is even really close. There's no way it's going to win, it's just too divisive of an ending, but it would have my vote. Uh-oh, that's our list. Thanks for doing this with me, Mish.
Happy to be here. Do we have an ending?
No. Watch the video I did with Nitish next week or in a few days or whatever. It's about the drama shows. Bye.